As we were discussing just before the break, several Labour MPs have received death threats for either refusing to back a ceasefire in Gaza, that's just a few of them, but also for actually backing a ceasefire during a vote in the Commons last week. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has spoken to police to ensure the safety of Labour MPs. The GMB union, indeed, has actually advised many MPs, obviously with their staff also facing threats as well, to only meet with other people present when they're meeting with constituents. This, of course, when we've had in the last recent years, both Joe Cox and David Amos, a Labour MP and a Tory MP, both killed by extremists. Well, joining me right now to discuss this is Labour MP for Birmingham Selly Oak and Chair of Labour Friends of Israel, Steve McCabe. Good afternoon to you, Steve.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, it really is quite astonishing that in 21st century Britain, MPs could be asked to vote on something in the House of Commons. Now, I could disagree or agree with anybody having any vote in the House of Commons, but the idea that I'd think, yeah, I'm now going to go and threaten that MP, death threats, throw paint all over their office, intimidate their staff, send them angry, really aggressive messages, and that would happen in this country. If you told me that 10 years ago, I would have thought that you were making it up. But this seems to be now routine. Most of the aggression towards MPs has been those MPs who didn't defy the Labour whip and who didn't vote with the SNP for a ceasefire in Gaza. They're being accused of, being, Palestinian baby killers and the like. We've also seen at least one Labour MP who did vote for the ceasefire saying she's received some threats, Islamophobic threats, she says. What do you make of this? And what are MPs doing to keep themselves safe?
Well, I think it shows that there's a very intolerant component to protests at this moment. I mean, it's not unique to this event. We've seen the same thing with the kind of Just Stop Oil protests and things like that. There's a very kind of aggressive, hostile and intolerant component to protests, which I think is, it's very unusual in this country. This is a country that normally allows protests, but the kind of general rule of thumb is it should be broadly peaceful and law-abiding. I think it just, it's people saying their view is going to prevail. It's possibly influenced by the number of posts in social media, but their view is going to prevail, and they are not willing to listen or entertain the idea that there may be an equally valid alternative opinion. And it's obviously making politics more difficult. I mean, it is ridiculous that MPs are having to have police and security staff at their advice centres.
Well, you say ridiculous. It's terrifying and outrageous and sinister that should be the case. You seem to be well, this is just how things are. But when did that happen? When did not getting your way in a parliamentary vote mean that people got intimidated? Because I think it's rather a new thing, to be honest with you. I think this is, I don't think it is just from social media. I think, the vast majority of these threats of violence, if you don't get your own way, are coming from two sides which have bizarrely chosen to sort of come together on this particular issue of Hamas and Gaza and Israel. And that is the far left and also, extremist Islam. And, and they have come, and by the way, if you're supporting Hamas, you are extremist Islam. These people coming together, they have ostensibly very little in common, and yet that they somehow seem to basically be going down the same route together.
Yeah, well, I mean, any kind of protest that attracts a lot of attention also attracts extremists, and you're quite right, we are seeing an interesting coalition over the Palestine protests between the hard left and people who purport to represent Palestinians. But we saw the same thing recently with the far right at the cenotaph. These people are looking for a ruck. Let's not kid ourselves on. I just think that their actual understanding or their concern for the issue that they claim to be protesting about is rather limited. Anyone who had looked at the Labour amendment the other evening, who was concerned to actually see a pause, humanitarian aid, talks towards a cessation of the violence, would have had absolutely no difficulty with that. They're dancing on the head of a pin over the use of the term ceasefire, when they know perfectly well that there are obvious technical reasons why neither side is ready to have those talks.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it gets really, really scary, I think, is that when, before you say dancing on the head of a pin over this stuff, the idea that, we see what's going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza right now, and that everyone is going to be looking over going, oh, look, the whole Labour front bench and backbenchers have all joined SNP in the British Parliament and have voted for a ceasefire. In that case, we'll stop all the bombing and all the babies will live happily ever after. It's an absolute nonsense. And frankly, I think a bit of an insult to the people who are suffering right now, whether in Israel or in Gaza. And that's the thing I find really, it is sixth form politics of the worst kind, but with the added edge of a threat as well. But there are a lot of people also pointing out, you get the likes, say, Yvette Cooper's worried about Labour MPs' safety. We've got GMB Union saying that, telling staff, telling MPs you need to make sure you've got more than one person there because staff are at risk. When we see, Jo Cox, stabbed to death as she was outside her constituency office. David Emmer stabbed to death in a church where he was actually holding constituency surgery, being at risk. But actually the staff are also at risk if they could get attacked. But are we just going to accept that that's just a thing? That that's what happens now? Or are we going to tackle the underlying issue, which is that we have basically said that somehow that the level of debate in this country can go down to this level, and that we've got people on one side who are accusing. I'm saying someone's a useful idiot about Hamas and that they're not being realistic, but they're calling me for not saying I want a ceasefire a baby killer. One side is using more extreme language than the other.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned social media earlier, I think that does encourage people to use quite extreme language and to hide behind it, people who might not be quite so willing to say that to your face. That was really what prompted me to refer to that. Look, if it carries on like this, then obviously it will become harder and harder for members of Parliament to have frank, open exchanges with constituents, and the right to protest will ultimately end up being curtailed in this country. That is painfully obvious. In a funny sort of way, I don't underestimate the threat to MPs, but it's the other people we should be thinking about. Staff, often MPs employ quite young staff. I had constituents who wanted to come and see me at an advice centre on Saturday morning, people who had particular individual difficulties and problems, some of them very concerned, some of them quite vulnerable people, and they were frightened to come to my advice centre because of the characters and the behaviour outside. Yeah,
that is quite telling, isn't it? Are you worried by some on your benches, fellow Labour MPs, who are being either just playing to the tune of some of the extremist demands that we're seeing, or lots of people saying, I've been under a lot of pressure from my local community, from my voters. Most of the MPs that voted with the SNP, calling for a ceasefire, using some of the most really quite colourful language on this, have large Muslim populations. They're saying, look, I'm being pressured. I'm being told this is what my constituents want, so I have to go along with that. That we are seeing voting and dividing lines along religious, racial lines in this country. That is not something we have seen before, and that is not something that is healthy.
Well, it's certainly not something that should be encouraged. Look, the thing is, I think every sane, civilised person in this country would like to see a cessation of violence and actually a permanent peace in this part of the world. We don't get it by people waving placards and shouting. And everybody who tries to elevate this into a dividing line in this country is actually taking attention off the efforts to address the fundamental problem. So, I kind of think that people who are doing this are either being exceedingly naive or they are deliberately misrepresenting the situation because they want to have a dispute about something else.